Welcome, everybody. Welcome to today's session. Here we have Kavita Tana and Dr. Nick Pozek. Welcome, both of you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much. And thank you all of you for joining us as we advance the discourse and inspire actions to transform education for human flourishing. ICTE 2024 celebrates the theme Transformative Education for Human and Planetary Flourishing. In this fireside chat, we will explore innovative ways to use digital technologies to preserve and promote cultural heritage in aesthetic education. We will be discussing how virtual and augmented reality, digital archiving, and online platforms can be used to make traditional art forms and cultural practices more accessible and engaging to new generations. We will explore if this is a fair way of respecting and maintaining their authenticity and cultural significance. We look forward to answering any questions or insights from the audience, and thank you for investing your time with us today. With me beside this virtual fire is Nick Posek, an educator, mediator, and strategist. He is the incoming president of the Greater New York chapter of the Association for Conflict Resolution, assistant director of Asian law programs at Columbia University, and vice chair of the board of trustees of Global Community Charter School. Previously, Nick held leadership roles at prominent cultural and educational organizations, including the League of American Orchestras, Asia Society, and the Carnegie Museum of Art. Nick received his doctorate in educational leadership from Wilkes University after earning his BFA and MAM degrees from Carnegie Mellon University. Wow, so honored and privileged to be with you today, Dr. Posek.
Thank you so much. The students that are more familiar call me Dr. Nick, but I really just please call me Nick.
Yes, thank you, Nick.
Yes, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you everyone who's joining us. For both Kavita and I, this is 6 a.m. for us, but I know that others are joining at less conducive time, so your presence is very much appreciated. Also, I extend my full gratitude to the organizers of this wonderful conference. This is quite a stellar lineup, and I'm also honored to be among such esteemed speakers.
Thank you, Nick. And yes, definitely echo those sentiments. And it really is exciting to be part of this conference as a speaker with you, because I've attended a few sessions in the past. And so let's get into some of the questions that I have for you, because we did meet before the session. And one of the things that piqued my curiosity was your experience with digital archiving. And we really sort of got into some details about that and what does that mean really? And so I wonder if you might enlighten us all, and probably extend some of what you shared with me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of that, and you'd mentioned right before we went on stage, is my work at Asia Society, where we have this. So Asia Society has this fantastic collection, the J.D. Rockefeller III. It's this wonderful collection of about 300 family objects, the really masterworks through the broad scope of Asian history. And one of the projects I led in collaboration with a truly excellent registrar was and I'm going to be very careful about the terms here, the digitization of the collection, which we sort of wonder, what does it mean to digitize something? And that's a problematic term. We can get into that later, but I'll tell you the more practical piece of the work. We did a series of really crisp, high-resolution photographs, and I will actually show you a bit of this if I can get these slides to work quickly. Let's see if we can do this. Share screen, window. Yeah, absolutely. So right now you're seeing one of the objects from the collection. We did these beautiful 360-degree scans of these objects through high-res photographs and then stitch them together so we could give viewers a really clear sense of what the presence of these objects were like. This is in 2014 or so, and so this is well before the pandemic, but it became incredibly useful during the pandemic for scholars to be able to, and scholars all over the world to be able to have access to these objects for doing research when they couldn't physically visit the collection archives in New York. And this process was through taking the objects, putting them on essentially a turntable, and then taking lots and lots of photographs while spinning these objects. So very much like stop motion photography, right? Turn it literally an eighth of a degree, take a photograph, turn it another eighth of a degree, take a photograph. And it took several sessions over the course of a year to capture all 300 or so objects. So I will turn off my slide. So that was one part of it. So I have this other hat where I'm a mediator, and so I deal with issues of conflict resolution and mediating conflicts around cultural heritage. And to some extent, there's a dimension which is the digitization of cultural heritage, and this question of, okay, what does it mean to digitize something? And what does it mean to have an object exist as a digital surrogate, and what rights are held with those? And in many situations, I'm finding debates over whether an object should have or could be photographed well after it has been. And that presents interesting challenges. There's a tendency for museums in particular to assume that everything should be digitized. There was a moment in which the national collections of French museums, which had objects which were frankly looted, the idea that the objects should be repatriated, which, on one hand is the absolute right thing to do, right? Objects looted from places like Benin should be returned. But before they would be returned, there's an effort to digitize them, or there's a call to take photographs of these objects to make sure that they're archived before they're restituted. That poses, of course, complicated moral questions, especially when looking at French intellectual property law, where photographers invariably have moral rights to their photographs. So there's this question, okay, an object that the museum shouldn't have had in the first place, now rights to the image of the work are owned by some kind of arbitrary French photographer in a way that's irrevocable. And on one hand, that may seem fine because digital photographs aren't a precious thing. At the same time, they do in some capacity diminish the uniqueness of an object. And that is a decision that really needs to be made by the communities rather than by museums. And so I'm always keen to be in this place where I get to look at both sides of this equation. What are our responsibilities in institutions? What are the responsibilities to community? What does ownership mean? What does stewardship mean? How are those two things in tension?
Mm-hmm. Fascinating subjects to consider, especially as you're thinking about transforming education for human and planetary flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
How does all of those questions, the dilemma, the ethics, the morals behind all of that contribute to human and planetary flourishing, when a lot of people would argue that a lot of the decisions that we are making, we're not considering the ethics and morals of, and therefore we are finding that human and planetary flourishing is not happening, And so a lot of people may not have made the direct line connection between the state of the world today for humanity and the planet with something like digitizing artifacts, particularly because there is, for some, a keen desire to have students being able to access these artifacts more easily, particularly, it becoming an equity issue. So I guess my next question really is around that side of things, that when we think about, this element of flourishing, we think about equity and access to historical artifacts, and then what technology now allows us to do with this digitizing of these beautiful items, some of which you just shared on the slides. Where do you sort of sit on that? Where do you feel that, we need to be having deeper conversations?
I think those conversations need to be situated in community, right? They need to be situated in the appropriate owners of these objects rather than broader access and interest. I think there is a tendency to, and this comes out of a very specific kind of neoliberal, almost libertarian view that information should invariably be free, which is, on one hand, this very noble Library of Alexandria kind of view of things, but at the same time also obstructs, obfuscates, contradicts the actual needs of creators. So, for example, a more kind of practical and contemporary example would be Google's efforts to digitize books, right? To just go to the library and be like, okay, well, we will make access to all these books free. Um, but that doesn't really. What we forget is that they're not just doing they're not doing it out of the kindness of their hearts, or maybe there's part of that, but there also is a monetization that happens somewhere, right? Ultimately, this leads to traffic to Google. This leads to ad sales, and that's really what it is, right? There's those companies that are selling advertisements that are reaping the benefits of this rather than the authors or the creators. And the same thing happens with objects, right? And the same thing happens with material, visual, and tangible culture. That somebody is profiting from it. And if we go along with this delusion that it should all just be available for free and available as open access, we're not really paying attention to who's actually receiving the benefits. And generally, when we don't do that, the benefits are going to the owners of platforms rather than those that create the content or form the content for it. And often that these objects are in many cases acquired, not Asia Society's collection, but certainly other collections. And I look at French museums collections in particular, but also the British Museum collection. These objects are already acquired through tremendous atrocities. This only compounds the damage rather than alleviates it or cures it.
Yeah, yeah, and we've got some agreement in the audience there, and also, that's a new insight for others, and so I, really appreciate you sort of sharing those insights from that perspective, and really thinking about here with this being a gathering about education and schooling, there is a question about how might we think about this in the context of the school environment. So you mentioned that these conversations need to be happening within community, and particularly within the communities from which the artifacts originated. It was the sort of implication, if you like. But I guess a lot of educators are here sort of wondering, like, okay, if we want to teach our students about the ethics of this, or we want to teach our students, like what's actually happening when we're accessing digitized artifacts. Do you have any advice for educators? Do you have any way of sort of suggesting that educators might deal with this situation? Because as you mentioned already, things are already out there in various forms, right? This isn't like we're at the beginning of that journey, things are out there, and how might we have these powerful conversations with our students?
Well, this gets into the area of property law, what's quite wonderful is that the younger kids get, the greater sense of justice they have and the greater sense of fairness they have. They have an intrinsic sense of what is fair and what is right and what is owed to them. You take siblings and you divide, I don't know, you divide a brownie or something like that, and anything less than the completely equal to a subatomic level division, they will let you know. And that's a great place to begin this conversation, right? What is fair? What is owed? I can't imagine a child not, wanting to endorse extractive logics or wanting to really claim something that isn't theirs, or when you kind of ask them to really think through these questions, there's a whole host of understanding that I think gets lost in the kind of abstraction that we tend to use when we think about platformization, or when platformization becomes a part of our process. So it's easy to dock into the conversation about justice, and that's something that gets lost quite easily in ideas of pageantry, in the exhaustion of education.
Mm.
It's I don't think the conversation needs to, and I don't want to put all of this on, because everything always gets lopped onto educators. It's like, okay, well, let's have educators do more of things. I don't want to say that educators aren't responsible for being mindful of the stewardship of cultural heritage, but I really think it falls far more downstream on those industries and platforms and organizations and institutions uh, to be thinking more critically about their digitization practices than it necessarily is a question of access for educators.
Great. Yeah, it's so interesting how much resonance I'm feeling hearing you answer that question, because during the pandemic, we went into a bit of a deep dive, all of us as educators, why did we become teachers? Like
Mhm.
what was the real reason that brought us into that profession? And for me, I discovered that it really is a justice issue. And the way that I've been expressing it is that if I'm able to do something, and someone next to me wants to be able to do that thing but doesn't quite know how, then there's a responsibility on me to see if I can support them through that learning journey, and that's sort of where teaching sort of came for me. And so, according to my dad, I've been doing that since I was 7. But it's one of those interesting things. And so, in terms of that very direct personal gift that I'm offering that person of, my information, knowledge, lived experience, the meaning that I've made of a particular situation, has brought me to a point of purpose. And I guess where we're sort of going in this conversation is really to invite educators, as you say, not to take on another thing, but just to have that in their awareness that, like, okay, the conversation needs to start somewhere. And we don't all have access to, the powers that be on the various platforms that have been named in the chat here of Google and Amazon and Twitter or X, or, like all of these kind of platforms. So, we might have healthy conversations with our students. And as you said, starting with, well, what are our younger children's concepts of what is fair and what is not fair? So I guess, as we're sort of developing this conversation, there might be people that are taking a stand on one side or another. And I know that part of your work and your experience, and you alluded to it earlier, is around mediation. And so I wonder if you might share some insights with our audience about that work, about how to mediate sometimes difficult conversations, and how to be the person that's holding space for people that have different opinions about a particular situation.
It's hard to do, and it's I think with holding space with people of different opinions, so I'm going to answer this almost in reverse order. There's a certain degree to which you have to endure really visceral experiences of frustration and tension, and just recognize, like, hey, that is the part of being human in the world today, is feeling a sense of disease with ideas to which you're not particularly comfortable, and then figuring out, okay, where do these exist in your moral compass? There's a thing that is happening right now in conversations about mediation, about this idea of neutrality, which used to be the ideal for the mediators, that you are this person that is going to be a neutral arbiter. And that's just wrong. We can't do that. We are, as humans, that is not a thing that is in our wet work wiring, right? We can't be neutral, but we can be impartial. That's the thing that we can do. We can say, hey, we are here to work between the interests of two parties, and we are not on the side of one party or the other, but instead we are on the side of finding a path forward, whatever that may be, and to work with parties to co-create that path forward. It's a matter of mutual determination. Otherwise, the other process, the kind of counterpoint of that, is litigation, where it's, okay, yeah, the two parties can't decide, then okay, the grown-up, right, the judge will decide, or this will be through a process of working with the court, and then jury will inform the judge, and there we go, and then everyone pays a lot of money. So the practice of mediation, I deal specifically with disputes around cultural heritage and these questions of what are, and to backtrack a bit of what this is. So oftentimes, and I tend to work a lot with UNESCO heritage sites, there will be a very large campaign to create a UNESCO heritage site or to have a physical plant inscribed into the World Heritage List. And generally that is a positive thing. That's a good thing. That is something that is desired and inspired because there's a lot of options for protection. There's also opportunities for tourism, and that can really be, tourism can be tremendously useful for bolstering the economy of a community. And fortunately, in many situations, the interests of tourism boards often overshadow or overpower those of local communities in ways that are deleterious to those communities and in ways that actually take a certain amount of time to be realized. So a lot of the sites I have worked at, we've seen the economy of a community really well served by that, but then we see really practical issues that come up. For example, tourism boards, or what are often spun up are heritage boards. Those tend to create really difficult rules for communities to follow. And also, for example, sites will have new building facade restrictions where new windows can't be installed. And so in certain climates, that becomes quite problematic when now everyone needs aircon, global warming necessitates that, but buildings become very coolant inefficient. So they become quite hot and unpalatable, and they become very expensive to keep at a reasonable temperature, or repairs become extremely expensive, right? New technology can't be used. Oftentimes the local craftspeople who have the specific knowledge of these building structures aren't really subsidized in any useful way, or there isn't any apparatus for continuity of practice, and so those skills are lost. And so it becomes really difficult for anyone to maintain both the practice of creating historical objects and doing so in a historic building. And so those facades are then taken over by the industries that can do that can actually meet all these requirements. And that forces local craftspeople and local industries outside of the actual designated heritage area.
Mhm.
And it also means that these large sort of externally produced tchotchke manufacturers take over. And then that creates this whole other challenge of resilience where these communities become so reliant on tourism that the actual local production falls out. And then what we've seen in the pandemic, especially in neighborhoods like Hoi An, where 90% of all their local industry is tourism related. And when they don't have local tourists, they struggle and things get even worse and more brittle. And the irony of that is that all these crafts is the local craft and local intangible culture production is just hollowed out because it becomes completely unsustainable.
Right. So, and you're part of mediating between the community where the heritage site is and UNESCO coming in and doing this work in its most simplified form.
Yeah, I rarely engage with UNESCO proper because once the designation happens, they're kind of on to the next thing.
Mhm.
But oftentimes there'll be situations in which there are, and these conversations always have a lot of stakeholders, and that's what
Right.
makes it really to like kind of most fun and interesting for me is that
Yeah.
the stakeholders of a town are every single individual in that town, right? And so it's working with not just like community leaders or like the 5 people that are the most prominent voices of the community, but also figuring out those folks that aren't represented. Then there's, heritage boards, boards of tourism. So there's government individuals. There are a number of private sector individuals. I think it's been really interesting in especially Southeast Asia now. We will have, these massive hotel chains that also want to, and, for reasons, they are stakeholders, whether we like it or not, that also need to be a part of this conversation. And they are involved. In particular, one thing that tends to come up quite a lot at these sites are when tourism boards give hotels carte blanche to build in areas. A number of times hotels take advantage of, how would I put it, sort of holes in local laws and local regimes or local law enforcement in order to do things that maybe they shouldn't. And so things like water pumping, that then creates a whole bunch of other downstream issues. The water tables get quite low, we get to droughts, especially when hotels have water parks, right? It's
Right.
literally have like all the water. It's like, we always say extractive industries, like you can actually see the extraction of water going from, local community, from having access to local communities to like a pool in a hotel or to a water feature in a hotel. And that creates a whole bunch of both equity issues, but also really practical sustainability issues for local communities. And
Yeah.
so we have to have these conversations. And oftentimes these conversations can be quite protracted because the first couple of sessions are just everybody restating why what they do is important and no one wanting to make any sort of budge because all of these industries are they're quite interlinked and they're also quite fickle.
Right. And so, thinking about that as, adults are sort of being, as you said, right, interlinked and fickle, it's like how to create more opportunities for people to practice that kind of, conversation and to be flexible and adaptable and all of these kind of things. And it feels like we've got a potential, project idea for many classrooms where, we've got someone in the chat, I think it's Sarita. Hi, Sarita. Thank you for sharing that. There seems that there's recently been a number of World Heritage Sites in Africa. So it's 147 out of the 1,223 World Heritage Sites. And that is something that needs to be discussed, especially with all of the issues that you just highlighted. And there's a particular sort of tool, there's root cause trees, there's the reference to the UN Sustainable Development Goals that could come into this project. There's lots of different resources that we could use that are freely available out there to really have a meaningful discussion about, are we making good choices when we're saying that, because in the name, it sounds like it's, we're protecting something, we're protecting a valuable piece of history, but it does have a consequence on the people that are living in that area. And as you said, it's important to be in conversation with those communities before making these decisions and all the consequences that have, that come from that. So thank you so much, Dr. Pozek, for sharing your experiences, both with digital archiving and with mediation. And we know it's a sensitive subject, so it's hard to sort of give very, very specific examples, but it's helpful to know that that you're out there in the world doing this important work to try and have people have these important conversations. And people can reach you on various social media channels, I believe, for sure LinkedIn, and so so I hope that people will reach out to learn more. And it's been a pleasure to sort of have this conversation with you. But honouring our time, I just want to thank you and the audience for listening today. And it's been wonderful to be here, and you're welcome, Sarita. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Kavita. This is a wonderful conversation. And thank you to everyone for joining us this early in the morning or late, wherever you may be.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nick, Kavita. Thank you so much. That was an incredible session. I don't think we have any questions, do we? Okay, I think we have one here. I think we can do it quickly. Here.
Can you give us more examples with different subjects at school? Um, yeah, will say really practically that conversations about cultural heritage can be introduced into just about anything. And also practices of mediation could be introduced. I would strongly suggest, I'm on the board of a charter school, we have peer mediation programs, which I think every school should really focus on building out. That is, instances where you have students in conflict and you bring in another student to help them have a conversation, help them work through their conflict, rather than having adults serve as the arbitrators for it. Those often just produce really powerful and really profound results for everyone involved. And I think that's a great place to start.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, both of you. I hope you have a great rest of the day, and I hope you join the rest of our sessions as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is
Thank
conversation been wonderful.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
you. Bye bye.